welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we'll drift across the vast British Empire, where the sun never set on distant shores and trade winds carried ships to every corner of the globe. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now, and let your body settle into this moment. Feel the weight of yourself against whatever surface supports you. Tonight, we journey across centuries and continents, following the rise and transformation of an empire that once stretched across a quarter of the world's surface. Imagine yourself standing on the white cliffs of Dover, looking out across the English Channel. The wind carries salt and the cries of seabirds. Below, waves crash against ancient chalk, the same chalk that has witnessed Romans, Saxons, Normans, and countless others who have called these islands home. The year could be any year across 8 centuries of expansion and change. But we begin not with conquest or grand proclamations, but with something quieter. A merchant loading wool onto a small wooden ship. A navigator studying star charts by candlelight. A young man saying goodbye to his family before boarding a vessel bound for unknown waters. The British Empire was not built in a single moment of decision, but through thousands of individual choices, made by ordinary people who could never have imagined the scope of what they were creating. Tonight, we follow their stories, from the first tentative ventures beyond these shores to the eventual transformation of a global empire into something entirely new. Let your breathing slow and deepen. We have all the time in the world to explore this vast tapestry of human experience. The empire's story is also the story of millions of lives, lived across every continent, under every sky. And it begins, as so many great stories do, with the simple act of setting sail into the unknown. The morning mist clings to the Thames in the year 1497, and somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, a Genoese navigator named Giovanni Caboto adjusts his compass one final time. The English know him as John Cabot, and they have given him their blessing to seek a western route to the spice markets of Asia. His ship, the Matthew, creaks gently at her moorings, her hull dark with tar, her sails furled like sleeping wings against the grey London sky. The air smells of river mud and rope hemp, of the coal smoke already beginning to rise from the city's chimneys. Cabot's crew of 18 men move quietly about their final preparations, their breath visible in the cool morning air. They are not explorers in the grand sense, not conquistadors dreaming of golden cities. They are fishermen and merchants, seeking cod and commerce, following the paths that Vikings had traced centuries before across the cold North Atlantic. When the Matthew finally disappears beyond the horizon, she carries more than men and supplies. She carries the first threads of what will become the largest empire in human history, though none aboard could possibly know this. The medieval world that these early English ventures emerged from was small and inward-looking. England in the late 15th century was recovering from decades of civil war, the Wars of the Roses that had torn the kingdom apart. The population was perhaps 3 million souls, most of whom lived within a day's walk of where they were born. London was a city of perhaps 50,000, its streets narrow and muddy, filled with the sounds of craftsmen and traders, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the constant hammering of construction as the city slowly rebuilt itself. But even in this insular world, there were those who looked beyond the horizon. English merchants had long traded wool to Flanders, following sea routes that hugged the European coast. They knew the rhythm of tides and seasons, the feel of salt spray on their faces, the satisfaction of a hold full of goods bound for foreign markets. The spice trade called to them from across the world, promising profits that could transform lives and fortunes. The Portuguese had already shown the way south and east, around the Cape of Good Hope to India and beyond. Christopher Columbus, sailing under Spanish colors, had found something in the west, though what exactly remained unclear. For the English, there seemed to be only one route remaining, northwest, through the icy waters above the New World, to the passage that surely must connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This dream of a northwest passage would haunt English imagination for centuries to come. It was a dream built on hope and incomplete maps, on the belief that somewhere in the vast whiteness of the Arctic lay a corridor to the wealth of the Orient. Cabot's voyage to Newfoundland achieved little immediate gain, but it established something crucial, an English claim to North America, however theoretical. When he returned to Bristol with tales of waters so thick with cod that they could be taken in baskets, he planted seeds that would grow into something unimaginable. The Grand Banks fishing grounds off Newfoundland would draw English vessels for centuries, creating communities of fishermen who knew the North Atlantic as intimately as farmers knew their fields. These fishermen, anonymous in history's grand narratives, were the true pioneers. Year after year, they sailed into waters where icebergs drifted like floating mountains, where storms could arise with terrifying suddenness, where the aurora borealis painted the night sky in sheets of green and gold. They learned to read the water and weather, to navigate by dead reckoning when fog obscured the stars, to preserve their catch and salt for the long journey home. Their knowledge would prove invaluable when later generations began to think not just of fishing and trading, but of staying. The techniques they developed for surviving in harsh climates, for preserving food through long winters, for building relationships with indigenous peoples who knew secrets of survival that no European manual could teach, all of this became part of the foundation on which empire would eventually rest. By the middle of the 16th century, English vessels were regular visitors to North American waters. They had not yet established permanent settlements, but they had created networks of knowledge and relationship that stretched across the ocean. Ships' captains kept careful logs of currents and landmarks. Merchants maintained correspondence with contacts in distant ports. Sailors shared stories in taverns along the Thames, tales of strange new lands where trees grew larger than any in England, where rivers ran for hundreds of miles through forests that had never known an axe. But it was not just the lure of fish and furs that drew the English westward. By the 1550s, religious upheaval was tearing Europe apart, and England found herself increasingly isolated as a Protestant nation in a Catholic world. The Spanish controlled much of the known world beyond Europe, and they had made it clear that English ships were not welcome in their domains. The New World began to seem not just an opportunity for profit, but a necessity for survival. The stage was being set for something unprecedented, not just individual ventures seeking quick profits, but the systematic establishment of English communities beyond the ocean. The empire was still unborn, but its first movements could be felt, like a child stirring in the womb. The salt wind whips across the deck of the Golden Hind as she cuts through the swells of the Pacific Ocean, and Francis Drake stands at her prow like a figure from legend. The year is 1579, and he has just become the first Englishman to sail these waters, having threaded his ship through the deadly maze of the Strait of Magellan. Behind him lie months of raiding Spanish treasure ships along the coast of Peru and Mexico, his holds now heavy with silver and gold. Ahead lies the vast unknown of the Pacific, and beyond that, the dream of circumnavigating the globe. The Golden Hind herself is a marvel of Elizabethan shipbuilding, her hull a honey-colored oak that seems to glow in the morning sun. She is perhaps 150 feet from stem to stern, small by today's standards but perfectly suited to her purpose. Her crew of perhaps 80 men have grown lean and weathered during their months at sea, their faces bronzed by sun and salt, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who have seen wonders and terrors in equal measure. They have witnessed things no Englishman has ever seen before, Spanish colonial cities where indigenous craftsmen work silver into intricate forms that speak of artistic traditions stretching back centuries before Columbus. They have seen flamingos painting the sky pink at sunset, and condors riding thermal currents above peaks that pierce the clouds. They have felt earthquakes shake the earth beneath their feet, and watched volcanoes paint the night sky red with their fires. But Drake's voyage is about more than exploration or even piracy. It represents a fundamental shift in English thinking about their place in the world. For the first time, an English expedition has ventured beyond the traditional European sphere, has challenged Spanish and Portuguese claims to monopolize the oceans beyond Europe. Drake's raids on Spanish treasure ships are acts of war in all but name, sanctioned by Elizabeth I herself, who had invested in the voyage and would share in its profits. The queen who made this possible was herself a figure of contradictions. Elizabeth I, with her painted face and elaborate ruffs, her blazing red hair and imperious manner, ruled a nation that was still essentially medieval in structure but was beginning to dream of modernity. She spoke 6 languages fluently, could discuss philosophy with scholars and statecraft with ambassadors, yet she also understood the crude realities of power in an age when might often made right. Her court was a place of extraordinary cultural flowering, where William Shakespeare was writing plays that would endure for centuries, where Edmund Spenser crafted verse that painted Elizabeth as Gloriana, the fairy queen. Yet it was also a place of constant intrigue and danger, where courtiers vied for favor and enemies of the state could find themselves in the Tower of London, their lives forfeit to the crown's security. Elizabeth's relationship with the sea and those who sailed it was complex and calculating. She understood that England's future lay on the waters, not on the European battlefields where her predecessors had spent so much blood and treasure. The English Channel had always been England's shield, but Elizabeth began to envision it also as England's highway to the wider world. She encouraged men like Drake and Martin Frobisher and John Hawkins, giving them royal commissions that transformed their piracy into patriotic duty. When Drake returned from his circumnavigation in 1580, she came aboard the Golden Hind herself and knighted him on his own deck, a ceremony that symbolically blessed his actions and promised more to come. The Spanish ambassador protested furiously, demanding that the stolen treasure be returned and Drake punished as a common pirate. Elizabeth's response was characteristically oblique and devastating. She kept most of the treasure, used it to pay down England's national debt, and quietly began planning even more ambitious ventures. The psychological impact of Drake's voyage cannot be overstated. For the first time, ordinary English people began to imagine their nation as something more than a small, cold island off the coast of Europe. Pamphlets and ballads spread the story of his adventures, describing lands where spices grew wild, where precious metals lay in the earth waiting to be dug, where the sun shone brighter and the possibilities seemed endless. Maps began to change, showing English names on distant coasts. Nova Albion, Drake had called the land where he careened his ship on the coast of what would someday be California, claiming it for England and Elizabeth. The name would not stick, but the principle it represented would, that English ships could go anywhere on the seven seas, that English claims were as valid as Spanish or Portuguese ones, that the world was wide enough for English ambitions. This new confidence manifested itself in increasingly bold ventures. The Muscovy Company, chartered in 1555, opened trade routes to Russia through the Arctic Ocean, their ships threading through ice floes to reach Archangel, where they traded English wool for Russian furs, honey, and hemp. English merchants learned to survive the long Russian winter, to negotiate with Tsarist officials, to adapt their business practices to radically different cultures and climates. The Levant Company, established in 1581, created similar networks of trade and influence in the eastern Mediterranean, their factors living for years in Constantinople and Aleppo, learning Turkish and Arabic, building relationships that would endure through decades of European warfare. These were not conquests in the military sense, but they were the foundations of empire nonetheless, networks of English influence and interest that stretched across continents. Yet it was perhaps the Eastland Company and the later East India Company that would prove most significant. The Eastland Company, chartered in 1579, focused on trade with the Baltic, bringing back the naval stores that were essential to England's growing fleet: timber for masts and hulls, pitch and tar for waterproofing, hemp for rope and sailcloth. This trade may seem mundane compared to Drake's golden adventures, but it was arguably more important to England's long-term future. These companies represented something new in European commerce, joint stock ventures that could raise capital on a scale no individual merchant could match, that could sustain losses for years while building long-term profitable relationships, that could adapt and survive in ways that traditional medieval trade guilds could not. They were, in effect, the corporate foundations of empire, creating institutional frameworks that would outlast any individual ruler or government. But the most audacious dream of the Elizabethan age was yet to come: the establishment of permanent English colonies in the New World. The idea had been growing for decades, nurtured by men like Richard Hakluyt, who spent his life collecting and publishing accounts of voyages and discoveries, creating a library of global knowledge that fired English imagination. His Principal Navigations, Voyages, Trafics and Discoveries of the English Nation, published in multiple volumes beginning in 1589, was nothing less than a blueprint for empire, demonstrating that English seamen had already traveled to every corner of the known world and were ready to claim their share of its riches. The morning sun filters through the Virginia forest in dappled patterns of gold and green, and Captain John Smith feels the weight of impossible responsibility on his shoulders. The year is 1607, and behind him lies the struggling settlement of Jamestown, its wooden palisades enclosing fewer than 100 souls who have survived the crossing from England. The air is thick with humidity and the buzzing of insects unlike any they knew in Europe. Strange bird calls echo through trees that tower above anything in English forests, their trunks so vast that 20 men holding hands could not encircle them. The colonists huddle in structures that are barely more than lean-tos, their English wool clothing sodden with sweat, their faces gaunt with hunger and touched with the yellow pallor of marsh fever. They had come expecting to find gold like the Spanish found in Mexico, or at least a passage to the Pacific and the wealth of Asia beyond. Instead, they have found a wilderness that seems to stretch endlessly westward, populated by indigenous peoples whose languages and customs are as mysterious as the forest paths they follow. Smith himself is a man shaped by violence and adventure. He has fought Turks in Hungary, been enslaved and escaped, traveled across Europe as a soldier of fortune. But nothing in his experience has prepared him for the challenge of keeping these colonists alive in a land that offers abundance to those who know its secrets, but threatens starvation to those who do not. The Powhatan Confederacy that controls much of the Tidewater region watches these English newcomers with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and calculation. Their leader, also called Powhatan, is a man of perhaps 60 years, his empire stretching across 30 tribes and 8,000 people. He has seen other Europeans before, Spanish explorers, perhaps French traders, and he understands that these pale-skinned strangers bring both opportunities and dangers. The famous encounter between Smith and Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, may or may not have happened as Smith later described it, but it represents something true about the early colonial experience. Survival depended on finding ways to bridge the vast gulf between European and indigenous ways of understanding the world. Pocahontas herself, whose real name was Amanuta, was perhaps 13 when the English arrived, a young woman coming of age in a world suddenly complicated by the presence of these foreign men who seemed to know so little about how to live in the land they claimed to possess. The first winter nearly destroyed Jamestown entirely. Of the 104 men and boys who had landed in May, only 38 survived until spring. They died of disease, of starvation, of wounds sustained in skirmishes with indigenous warriors who had every reason to view these intruders with suspicion. The survivors grew so desperate that some attempted to flee, planning to steal boats and try to sail back to England, preferring the risks of an Atlantic crossing in a small vessel to another winter in Virginia. But spring brought new ships from England, and with them new colonists and crucial supplies. More importantly, it brought a growing understanding that this land was not going to yield its treasures easily, that successful colonization would require not dramatic discoveries but patient adaptation to a new world's rhythms and possibilities. The colonists began to learn from their indigenous neighbors which plants could be eaten safely, how to construct dwellings suited to the climate, how to navigate rivers that could serve as highways into the interior. The transformation began with a plant that indigenous peoples had cultivated for centuries, tobacco. John Rolfe, who would later marry Pocahontas, experimented with crossing native tobacco varieties with seeds obtained from the Spanish Caribbean, creating a hybrid that was milder and more appealing to European tastes. The first shipment of Virginia tobacco reached London in 1614, and though it was only a few barrels, it represented the beginning of an economic revolution that would reshape both the colony and the empire. This economic success came at a terrible cost, though the full implications would not become clear for decades. Tobacco cultivation required far more workers than the colony could attract through voluntary immigration from England. The solution, imported from Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Caribbean, was slave labor. The first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in Virginia came in 1619, when a Dutch ship traded 20 people for supplies. Those 20 individuals, whose names and stories are largely lost to history, represent one of the most tragic threads in the empire's development. They came from societies with their own complex political systems, artistic traditions, and spiritual practices. Many had already survived the horrific Middle Passage across the Atlantic, crammed into ships where disease and death were constant companions. Now they found themselves in yet another alien environment, forced to clear forests and tend crops that would enrich people who regarded them as property rather than human beings. But the early colonial period was also marked by stories of individual courage and adaptation that transcend simple categories of victimizer and victim. Anthony and Mary Johnson, both originally enslaved, gained their freedom in early Virginia and established a successful farm on the eastern shore. They navigated the complex legal and social structures of colonial society, accumulated property, and raised a family that would persist in the historical record for generations. Their story illustrates the fluid nature of early colonial society, where boundaries between enslaved and free, European and African, colonist and indigenous were still being negotiated. It would not remain fluid for long. By the end of the 17th century, Virginia's legal code would establish racial slavery as a permanent condition, but in these early decades, individual determination and luck could sometimes overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The success of Virginia tobacco also established patterns that would repeat throughout the empire's expansion: the search for profitable export commodities, the transformation of indigenous landscapes to serve European markets, and the creation of social hierarchies that placed European colonists at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom, with indigenous peoples and various categories of unfree Europeans occupying ambiguous positions in between. Meanwhile, other English colonists were establishing different models of settlement further north. The Plymouth colony, founded in 1620 by religious dissidents seeking to worship according to their own understanding of Christian doctrine, represented a different vision of what English America might become. These colonists, whom later generations would romanticize as pilgrims, came as families rather than as individual fortune seekers. They intended to create not just profitable plantations but entire communities that would reflect their religious values and social ideals. William Bradford, who served as Plymouth's governor for most of its early decades, kept a detailed history of the colony's struggles and achievements. His account reveals men and women grappling not just with survival in a harsh environment, but with fundamental questions about how to organize society according to Christian principles. Should property be held in common or individually? How should the colony relate to the indigenous peoples whose lands they had claimed? What role should the church play in civil government? The diversity of these early colonial experiments would prove to be one of the English Empire's greatest strengths. Unlike Spanish America, which was governed by a single, centralized imperial bureaucracy, English America developed as a collection of separate colonies, each with its own charter, its own relationship with the crown, and its own approaches to the challenges of settlement and governance. This diversity created a laboratory of human experience, where different approaches to fundamental social questions could be tested and refined over time. The results would not always be admirable. The gradual institutionalization of racial slavery represents one of the darkest aspects of this experimentation, but the flexibility and adaptability that emerged from it would serve the empire well as it expanded into new environments and encountered new challenges across the globe. The trade winds blow steady and warm across the Caribbean Sea, carrying with them the scent of molasses and the sound of human suffering. The year is 1670, and on the island of Barbados, the sugar revolution has transformed what was once a struggling English colony into the most profitable piece of territory in the empire. Under the blazing tropical sun, rows of sugar canes stretch to the horizon, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets in the constant breeze. Between the rows, men and women whose ancestors came from a dozen different African kingdoms work under conditions that push the human body to its absolute limits. The transformation of Barbados from a tobacco-growing settlement to a sugar-producing powerhouse took less than a generation, but its effects would ripple across centuries and continents. The island's planters, men like James Drax and Thomas Modiford, had learned the techniques of sugar cultivation from Dutch and Portuguese colonists who were expanding their own operations in Brazil and other Caribbean islands. They discovered that sugar, unlike tobacco, required not just intensive labor but massive capital investment, mills to crush the cane, boilers to refine the juice, warehouses to store the finished product. Most importantly, it required far more workers than any previous colonial enterprise had ever attempted to organize. The solution came from across the Atlantic, where European traders had been purchasing enslaved people from African merchants and political leaders for more than a century. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, attempted to monopolize this trade for English merchants, but the profits were so enormous that private traders soon broke their monopoly, creating a complex network of slave ships that connected the harbors of Liverpool and Bristol to the slave markets of West and Central Africa, and from there to the plantations of the Caribbean and North America. The human cost of this system defies easy comprehension. Ships like the Brooks, a vessel that became infamous when abolitionists later published diagrams showing how human beings were packed into her holds like cargo, carried their human freight across the Middle Passage under conditions that killed perhaps 1 in 6 of those who began the journey. The survivors who reached Caribbean slave markets had already endured experiences that would mark them and their descendants for generations: the terror of capture or sale in Africa, the horror of the ocean crossing, the disorientation of arrival in a climate and landscape utterly different from anything they had known. Yet even in the midst of this systematic dehumanization, individuals found ways to maintain dignity, to preserve cultural traditions, and to resist the attempts to reduce them to mere property. On Barbados and Jamaica, in the Carolinas and Georgia, enslaved people created new languages that blended African and European elements, allowing communication across the many different ethnic and linguistic groups that the slave trade had brought together. They adapted their religious practices to new circumstances, often blending African spiritual traditions with the Christianity that their enslavers attempted to impose. They also resisted in more direct ways. Plantation records are filled with accounts of work slowdowns, tool breaking, and other forms of everyday resistance that made slave labor less efficient and more costly than planters had hoped. Some individuals ran away, attempting to disappear into the forests and mountains where small communities of escaped slaves, known as Maroons, established autonomous settlements that survived for generations despite constant pressure from colonial authorities. The most dramatic form of resistance was outright rebellion. In 1675, enslaved people on Barbados planned an island-wide uprising that was discovered only at the last moment. The planned rebellion involved coordinated attacks on plantation houses across the island, timed to coincide with a moment when many white colonists would be gathered in Bridgetown for a festival. The discovery of the plot led to brutal reprisals, but it also sent shockwaves through the English Caribbean, forcing planters to acknowledge that their prosperity rested on a foundation of human beings who had not accepted their enslavement as natural or permanent. The profits from sugar also transformed English society itself. Families like the Lascelles and the Beckfords accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of the greatest aristocratic houses, using their wealth to purchase country estates in England, to fund their sons' educations at Oxford and Cambridge, and to buy seats in Parliament where they could protect their Caribbean interests. The Georgian squares of London were built with sugar money, their elegant facades concealing the brutal realities of how such wealth was accumulated. But sugar also created new forms of global connection that had never existed before. A cup of tea sweetened with Caribbean sugar might be served in a London drawing room furnished with mahogany from Jamaica, while the conversation turned to the latest news from India, where the East India Company was expanding its operations, or from North America, where colonial merchants were building their own networks of trade and influence. The empire was becoming an integrated economic system in ways that earlier forms of European expansion had never achieved. This integration also created new vulnerabilities. When European wars disrupted Atlantic shipping, Caribbean planters found themselves cut off from essential supplies of food and lumber, leading to periods of famine and unrest that threatened the entire colonial structure. When sugar prices fluctuated in European markets, the effects rippled through colonial societies, determining whether plantations expanded or contracted, whether enslaved people faced harsher working conditions or slightly improved ones, whether colonial merchants prospered or failed. The Caribbean colonies also became laboratories for new forms of colonial governance. Unlike the North American colonies, where European settlement created communities that could eventually become self-governing, the Caribbean islands remained fundamentally dependent on external support. The white population never grew large enough to feel secure without military protection from the mother country, while the enslaved population was always so numerous that the constant threat of rebellion required elaborate systems of surveillance and control. Jamaica, captured from the Spanish in 1655, became perhaps the most important laboratory for these experiments in colonial control. The island's Blue Mountains provided refuge for escaped slaves who established maroon communities that successfully resisted colonial authority for decades. The most famous of these communities was led by a woman known as Nanny, whose knowledge of guerrilla warfare and ability to organize resistance made her a legendary figure among enslaved people throughout the Caribbean. The colonial government's eventual recognition of Maroon independence in 1739, through treaties that granted them autonomous territories in exchange for agreements to return future runaways, represented a pragmatic acknowledgement that total control was impossible. These treaties created a complex situation where slavery continued to define colonial society, but pockets of freedom existed within it, maintained by people who had literally fought for their liberty and won. The success of Caribbean sugar also influenced colonial development in other parts of the empire. In South Carolina, planters experimented with rice cultivation using techniques learned from enslaved people who had grown the crop in their African homelands. In Georgia, attempts to prohibit slavery in the colony's early years were abandoned when it became clear that profitable agricultural development seemed to require enslaved labor. The model established in Barbados, plantation agriculture based on enslaved labor producing crops for export to European markets, became a template that shaped colonial societies from Brazil to the Chesapeake. The monsoon rains drum against the windows of the East India Company's headquarters in Fort William, Calcutta, and Robert Clive listens to reports that will reshape an empire. The year is 1757, and the company's private army has just defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey, a victory won as much through bribery and political manipulation as through superior firepower. Outside, the Hooghly River flows thick and brown with monsoon runoff, carrying vessels from across the Indian Ocean, Chinese junks loaded with tea and silk, Arab dhows bearing spices and precious stones, and English East Indiamen whose holds are increasingly filled not just with trade goods but with the silver that will flow back to Britain as tribute and taxation. The transformation of the English East India Company from a trading enterprise into a territorial power controlling vast regions of the Indian subcontinent happened gradually, almost accidentally, driven more by immediate necessity than by grand design. When the company received its royal charter in 1600, its directors envisioned nothing more ambitious than establishing small trading posts along the Indian coast, following the Portuguese model of commercial empire that had proven so profitable in the previous century. They could never have imagined that their great-great-grandchildren would govern territories containing more than 100 million people, collecting taxes that would fund British wars across the globe. The India that English merchants first encountered was not a single political entity but a complex mosaic of kingdoms, princely states, and trading communities, held together by the gradually weakening authority of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal court at Delhi still commanded respect and tribute from across the subcontinent, but real power was increasingly fragmented among regional rulers who governed their territories with varying degrees of independence. For European merchants, this political fragmentation created both opportunities and dangers, opportunities to play different rulers against each other, but also the constant risk of finding themselves caught in conflicts they did not understand and could not control. The English East India Company's early factories, fortified trading posts at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and eventually Calcutta, were tiny islands of European authority in an Indian Ocean of political complexity. The merchants who staffed these factories lived lives of extraordinary isolation, separated not just by thousands of miles from their families and homeland, but by vast cultural differences from the societies that surrounded them. They learned to navigate Indian commercial practices, to negotiate with local officials whose authority might rest on ancient tradition or recent conquest, to adapt their business methods to monsoon seasons and religious festivals and the countless other rhythms of Indian life. Some of these merchants, men like Thomas Pitt, grandfather of the future Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, accumulated enormous personal fortunes through a combination of legitimate trade and activities that company policy officially discouraged but practically tolerated. Pitt's purchase of the famous diamond that would eventually adorn the crown of France illustrates the extraordinary opportunities that Indian trade offered to Europeans willing to take enormous risks. But it also illustrates the moral ambiguity that characterized so much of early colonial enterprise, wealth that flowed to Europe through channels that were never entirely legal or entirely illegal, but existed in gray areas where company policy, imperial law, and local custom intersected in complex and often contradictory ways. The gradual transformation from trade to territorial control began with what company officials called subsidiary alliances, agreements to provide military support to Indian rulers in exchange for exclusive trading privileges and territorial concessions. These alliances seemed like simple business arrangements, but they gradually drew the company into the political and military conflicts that racked 18th-century India. Each intervention required further interventions to protect existing interests, until the company found itself responsible for governing territories and populations that it had never intended to rule. The Battle of Plassey, fought on June 23, 1757, marked the moment when this gradual drift toward territorial control became irreversible. Clive's victory over Siraj-ud-Daulah, the young Nawab of Bengal, was achieved through a combination of superior military discipline and elaborate political intrigue that involved bribing the Nawab's own generals to abandon him at the crucial moment. The battle itself lasted only a few hours and involved relatively few casualties, but its consequences were profound. It gave the East India Company control over Bengal, the richest province of the Mughal Empire, with a population larger than Britain's and tax revenues that dwarfed anything the company had previously imagined. The wealth that flowed from Bengal to Britain in the decades following Plassey was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1757 and 1857, the company extracted the equivalent of trillions of dollars in today's currency from the Indian subcontinent. This wealth funded Britain's transformation into the world's first industrial power, providing the capital that built factories, financed technological innovation, and supported the infrastructure that would make Britain the workshop of the world by the middle of the 19th century. But this wealth came at an enormous cost to the Indian populations under company rule. The company's taxation policies, designed primarily to maximize revenue extraction rather than to support local development, placed crushing burdens on agricultural communities that had little political recourse. When monsoon failures led to harvest shortfalls, company policy often prevented local authorities from providing relief, leading to famines that killed millions of people while company officials continued to collect taxes and export grain to more profitable markets. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed perhaps 10 million people, one-third of Bengal's population, while company revenues actually increased, as surviving peasants were forced to sell their possessions to pay taxes on behalf of their dead neighbors. Company officials like Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, struggled to balance the demands of shareholders in London with the realities of governing populations whose welfare they were responsible for but whose interests they were not primarily motivated to serve. Yet even within this exploitative system, individual relationships of respect and mutual benefit sometimes developed. British officials who spent decades in India often developed deep appreciation for Indian culture, learning Sanskrit or Persian, studying Indian philosophy and art, and forming friendships that transcended the formal hierarchies of colonial rule. Men like William Jones, who founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, pioneered scholarly approaches to Indian history and literature that revealed the depth and sophistication of Indian intellectual traditions to European audiences. Indian merchants and administrators also found ways to prosper within the colonial system, using their knowledge of local conditions and networks to become essential intermediaries between British officials and Indian communities. Banking families like the Jugat Seths accumulated vast fortunes by financing company operations, while individuals like Dwarkanath Tagore, grandfather of the Nobel Prize-winning poet Rabindranath Tagore, created business empires that spanned continents. The company's military expansion across the subcontinent also depended heavily on Indian soldiers, sepoys, who constituted the vast majority of its armed forces. These men, recruited primarily from the martial communities of northern India, served in campaigns that took them from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Burma, fighting with discipline and courage that earned the respect of their British officers but also learning military skills and organizational techniques that would eventually be turned against company rule. By 1800, the East India Company controlled territories stretching from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the river deltas of Bengal. It maintained armies larger than most European powers, administered complex legal systems that blended British and Indian law, and governed populations more diverse in language, religion, and culture than existed anywhere else under a single political authority. This vast experiment in commercial empire was profitable beyond the dreams of its founders, but it was also unstable in ways that would eventually prove fatal. The company's employees, from clerks to governors general, were motivated primarily by personal enrichment rather than imperial duty. Corruption was endemic, policy was often incoherent, and the company's Indian subjects had little reason to feel loyalty to an organization that treated them primarily as sources of revenue. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test whether commercial empire could be transformed into something more sustainable and just, or whether the contradictions built into company rule would ultimately tear it apart. The answer would come in the middle of the 19th century, in ways that no one in Robert Clive's generation could possibly have anticipated. The fog rolls off Boston Harbor in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1773, and somewhere in that gray mist, the seeds of empire's first great crisis are about to be sown. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, bob at anchor with their holds full of East India Company tea, while on the wharves nearby, perhaps 8,000 colonists have gathered to debate what should be done with cargo that has become a symbol of everything they find objectionable about British rule. The air smells of salt and tar, of wood smoke from the city's chimneys, and underneath it all, the tension that comes when people realize they are approaching a point of no return. Samuel Adams, his gray hair pulled back in the style of an earlier generation, speaks to the crowd with the passion of a man who has spent decades building this moment. Around him are merchants and artisans, ministers and laborers, united by a growing conviction that the British Parliament's attempts to tax them without granting them representation strikes at the heart of English liberty itself. When Adams finally declares that this meeting can do nothing more to save the country, it is a signal that has been planned for weeks, and within minutes, men disguised as Mohawk Indians are boarding the 3 ships and dumping 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was the culmination of a decade of growing tension between Britain and her American colonies. The conflict had begun, ironically, with Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, which had expelled France from North America but left the British government with massive debts and vast new territories to govern. The attempt to make American colonists pay their share of the costs of their own defense seemed reasonable to officials in London, but it struck many colonists as a dangerous precedent that violated the fundamental principle that Englishmen could not be taxed without their consent. The Tea Act of 1773 was intended to solve several problems simultaneously. It would help the financially struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to American consumers. It would maintain the principle of parliamentary taxation by keeping a small tax on tea, and it would provide American consumers with cheaper tea than they could obtain through smuggling. Instead, it created the crisis that would ultimately tear the empire apart. The colonists who organized resistance to the Tea Act understood that they were challenging more than a single piece of legislation. They were asserting a different vision of what the British Empire should be, not a hierarchy in which Parliament in London could impose its will on colonial subjects, but a federation of equal communities united under the British Crown but governing themselves according to their own understanding of English liberty. This vision would prove incompatible with British understanding of sovereignty and parliamentary supremacy, making conflict virtually inevitable. Their debates revealed the complexity of the imperial crisis. Some, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, still hoped for reconciliation through constitutional reform that would give Americans representation in Parliament or create some form of imperial federation. Others, like Patrick Henry of Virginia, had already concluded that British and American interests were fundamentally incompatible and that independence was the only solution that could preserve American liberty. Most fell somewhere between these positions, hoping for a middle path that would preserve the benefits of imperial connection while securing American rights. The path to war was neither straight nor inevitable, but it was driven by a logic of escalation that proved difficult for either side to control. Each British action designed to restore order provoked colonial responses that British officials interpreted as rebellion. Each colonial assertion of rights seemed to British officials like a challenge to the entire imperial system. By the spring of 1775, both sides were preparing for the possibility of armed conflict while still hoping it could be avoided. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, began a war that would last 8 years and fundamentally transform the British Empire. The colonial militia who faced British regulars on Lexington Green that morning were not professional soldiers, but they represented something new in the history of empire: colonial subjects who were willing to fight for the right to govern themselves according to their own understanding of liberty and justice. The war that followed was both a civil war within the British Empire and an international conflict that drew in France, Spain, and the Netherlands. For the American colonists, it was a struggle for independence and self-determination. For the British, it was an effort to preserve the unity and authority of an empire that had become essential to Britain's prosperity and power. For other European powers, it was an opportunity to weaken Britain and perhaps gain territory or commercial advantages for themselves. The military campaigns that stretched from Canada to the Caribbean, from the forests of upstate New York to the rice fields of South Carolina, tested the limits of both British power and American determination. British forces, supported by the world's most powerful navy, won most of the major battles but found it impossible to control the territory they occupied or to convince a sufficient number of Americans that reconciliation was preferable to independence. The American victory at Yorktown in October 1781, achieved with crucial French support, effectively ended major combat operations and forced the British government to acknowledge that military victory was no longer possible. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, recognized American independence and established the new United States as a sovereign nation stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. The loss of the American colonies was a profound shock to British confidence and forced a fundamental reconsideration of how empire should be organized and governed. The attempt to treat mature colonial societies as permanently subordinate dependencies had failed catastrophically, costing Britain not only the most populous and prosperous part of her empire but also her position as the world's dominant power. Future imperial policy would have to take account of the possibility that successful colonies might eventually demand the right to govern themselves. Yet the American Revolution also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the British Empire. While losing the 13 American colonies, Britain retained Canada, the Caribbean islands, and her expanding territories in India. British merchants continued to trade profitably with the new United States, discovering that political independence did not necessarily mean economic separation. The empire that emerged from the crisis was smaller but in some ways stronger, more flexible in its governance and more realistic about the limits of central control. The revolution also had profound implications for other parts of the empire, particularly for the enslaved populations of the Caribbean and for the indigenous peoples of North America. The British promise of freedom to enslaved people who fought for the crown brought thousands to the British side, leading to the establishment of free black communities in Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone after the war. Many indigenous communities, recognizing that American expansion posed greater threats to their survival than British rule, sided with Britain and found themselves abandoned by the peace treaty that ignored their interests entirely. As the smoke cleared from 8 years of warfare, the British Empire faced a new world in which the old certainties no longer applied. The question was whether the lessons of the American Revolution could be learned and applied to create a more sustainable and just form of imperial governance, or whether the fundamental contradictions that had led to the crisis would simply manifest themselves in new forms in other parts of the empire. The morning sun casts long shadows across the parade ground at Simla, and Lord Curzon adjusts his pince-nez as he reviews dispatches from the northwest frontier. The year is 1901, and the British Empire has reached its zenith, a realm encompassing nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and population. From his summer residence in the Himalayan foothills, the Viceroy of India can contemplate territories that stretch from the Arctic shores of Canada to the tropical islands of the Pacific, from the ancient cities of Egypt to the gold mines of South Africa. Yet even at this moment of apparent triumph, the empire faces challenges that will test whether Victorian confidence can adapt to a changing world. The transformation of the British Empire in the 19th century was driven by forces that often seemed beyond human control: the Industrial Revolution that gave Britain unprecedented economic advantages, the steamship and telegraph that compressed distances and accelerated communication, and the complex interplay of European rivalries that turned Africa and Central Asia into chessboards where great powers maneuvered for strategic advantage. But it was also shaped by thousands of individual decisions made by proconsuls and merchants, soldiers and missionaries, who extended British influence and authority into regions that earlier generations had considered impossibly remote. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 had marked a watershed in imperial history, forcing the British government to confront the limitations of the East India Company's commercial empire and to assume direct responsibility for governing the subcontinent. The rebellion began among sepoys in the Bengal army who refused to use cartridges they believed were greased with cow and pig fat, violating both Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. But it quickly spread beyond the military, drawing support from dispossessed rulers, displaced landowners, and ordinary people who had accumulated grievances against company rule. Queen Victoria's proclamation announcing the new arrangements promised that Indians would be governed according to principles of justice and religious tolerance, that ancient rights and customs would be respected, and that advancement in government service would be based on merit rather than race or religion. These promises would never be fully kept, but they established ideals that would inspire future generations of colonial subjects to demand that the empire live up to its own stated principles. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed the strategic geography of empire, reducing the sailing time from London to Bombay from 3 months to 3 weeks and making India seem closer to Britain than ever before. The canal also made the eastern Mediterranean crucial to British interests in ways it had never been before, leading to the occupation of Egypt in 1882 and the gradual extension of British control up the Nile toward the source of that great river. The scramble for Africa that characterized the final decades of the 19th century saw British expansion driven as much by fear of being excluded by European rivals as by positive attractions of African territory. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 established the principle that European claims to African territory would be recognized only if accompanied by effective occupation, leading to a frantic race to plant flags and establish administrative control over vast regions that few Europeans had ever seen. Cecil Rhodes embodied both the opportunities and the moral contradictions of this new imperialism. The son of an English clergyman, he had arrived in southern Africa as a teenager hoping the climate would improve his fragile health. Instead, he discovered diamond mines that made him one of the richest men in the world, wealth that he used to extend British control from the Cape Colony north to the Zambezi River and beyond. His vision of a Cape to Cairo railway linking British territories across the length of Africa captured Victorian imagination, even as his methods of achieving it involved wars against African peoples and the systematic dispossession of their lands. The war's ultimate victory proved Pyrrhic, establishing British control over the gold mines of the Witwatersrand but at the cost of international reputation and imperial confidence. More importantly, it revealed that even small opponents could impose enormous costs on British power if they were determined enough and understood how to exploit Britain's vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, the great game between Britain and Russia played out across landscapes that seemed designed by nature to swallow armies and frustrate imperial ambitions. The British fear that Russian expansion through Central Asia might eventually threaten India led to interventions in Afghanistan that revealed the limits of Victorian military technology when confronted by determined resistance in impossible terrain. The First Afghan War of 1839–42 ended with the complete destruction of a British army retreating from Kabul, a disaster that became legendary throughout the empire as an example of what happened when imperial confidence exceeded imperial capabilities. Yet British India continued to expand, driven partly by strategic logic and partly by the momentum of military and administrative systems that had their own internal dynamics. The Second Burmese War of 1852 and the Third Burmese War of 1885 brought the entire Burmese kingdom under British control, while expeditions into the tribal territories of the northwest frontier established a rough boundary between the Indian Empire and Afghanistan that would remain contested for more than a century. In the Pacific, the acquisition of Australia and New Zealand followed patterns established earlier in North America, but with crucial differences shaped by geographic isolation and the timing of European contact with indigenous peoples. The first fleet that arrived in Sydney Harbour in 1788 carried not voluntary colonists seeking new opportunities, but convicts transported from British prisons as punishment for crimes that ranged from petty theft to political activism. These men and women, many of whom would never see Britain again, created colonial societies that were both recognizably British and profoundly shaped by their origins as penal settlements. The impact on Aboriginal peoples was catastrophic in ways that even the harshest critics of other forms of imperial expansion had not anticipated. Diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity swept through Aboriginal communities, while colonial expansion destroyed traditional hunting grounds and disrupted cultural practices that had sustained complex societies for tens of thousands of years. Unlike in India or even Africa, where British officials had to negotiate with existing political authorities, the colonial governments of Australia and New Zealand often acted as if indigenous peoples did not exist, or existed only as obstacles to be removed. Yet even within these harsh realities, individual relationships of respect and mutual benefit sometimes developed. Aboriginal guides like Jackie, who accompanied Edmund Kennedy's expedition to Cape York, and Bungaree, who sailed with Matthew Flinders on his circumnavigation of Australia, became essential to European exploration and understanding of the continent. Their knowledge and skills made European survival possible, even as European expansion threatened the survival of their own communities. The discovery of gold in Australia in the 1850s transformed the colonies from struggling settlements dependent on convict labor into prosperous societies that attracted voluntary immigrants from around the world. The goldfields created a more egalitarian social structure than existed in other parts of the empire, where anyone with luck and determination could potentially strike it rich regardless of their social background in the old country. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire had become a global system of unprecedented complexity and scope. British capital financed railways in Argentina and Canada, British engineers built harbours in Hong Kong and Bombay, British missionaries established schools and hospitals from Sierra Leone to the Solomon Islands. The empire had evolved far beyond the simple commercial relationships of earlier centuries into something that resembled a global civilization, held together by shared institutions, common languages, and networks of communication and transportation that span continents. The afternoon light slants through the windows of Government House in New Delhi, and Lord Mountbatten studies maps that will soon become historical artifacts. The date is August 15, 1947, and in a few hours, the British Raj will cease to exist, its territories divided between the new nations of India and Pakistan. Outside, crowds are gathering in the streets, some celebrating the arrival of independence, others fearful of the violence that partition has already begun to unleash across the subcontinent. The Union Jack that has flown over these buildings for nearly a century will be lowered at midnight, marking the end of the largest colonial empire in human history. The transformation of the British Empire into something entirely new, the Commonwealth of Nations, had been building for decades, driven by forces that no single policy or leader could control. 2 world wars had drained Britain's financial resources and revealed the limits of imperial power when confronted by determined enemies. The rise of new superpowers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, had created an international system in which British influence, however extensive, could no longer determine global outcomes. Most importantly, the colonial subjects whose labor and resources had sustained the empire for centuries had developed their own visions of political freedom and national identity that could no longer be contained within imperial frameworks. The process of decolonization had begun, paradoxically, with the empire's greatest apparent success, the victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the Second World War. That victory had been achieved only through the massive contribution of colonial troops and resources, demonstrating both the empire's continued strength and its fundamental dependence on the consent, however grudging, of colonial peoples. Indian soldiers had fought in Burma and North Africa, Canadian factories had produced weapons and aircraft, Australian and New Zealand forces had defended the Pacific, South African gold had helped finance the war effort. But the ideology of the war, the struggle for freedom and democracy against totalitarian oppression, made it increasingly difficult to justify denying those same freedoms to colonial peoples. The independence movement in India, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had developed new forms of resistance that proved remarkably effective against imperial authority. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, or non-violent resistance, transformed what might have been a traditional anti-colonial rebellion into something entirely new, a moral challenge to the very foundations of imperial rule that attracted international sympathy and made violent suppression politically impossible. The Salt March of 1930, in which Gandhi and thousands of followers walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea to make salt in defiance of British law, captured global attention and demonstrated that imperial authority depended ultimately on the cooperation of those being governed. The partition of India into separate Hindu and Muslim states was perhaps the most tragic aspect of decolonization, leading to massive population exchanges and communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The decision to divide the subcontinent was driven by the complex dynamics of Indian nationalism, where different communities had developed incompatible visions of what independence should look like. But it was also shaped by British attempts to maintain influence through divide-and-rule policies that had exacerbated communal tensions for political advantage. The human cost of partition would haunt both successor states for generations and raise troubling questions about whether the empire's final act had been managed with sufficient care for the welfare of those most affected by it. Elsewhere in the empire, decolonization followed different patterns shaped by local conditions and the specific history of each territory. In the White Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the transition to full independence was gradual and largely peaceful, marked more by the evolution of constitutional relationships than by dramatic moments of separation. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 had already granted these dominions legislative independence, making them equal partners with Britain within what became known as the Commonwealth. Their continued loyalty to the Crown and participation in imperial defense arrangements during the Second World War demonstrated that political independence did not necessarily mean the end of meaningful imperial connections. In Africa, the pace and character of decolonization varied enormously depending on the size of European settler populations and the degree of economic development that colonial rule had brought. Ghana's independence in 1957, achieved under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah and with relatively little violence, became a model for peaceful decolonization that inspired independence movements throughout the continent. But the settler colonies of East and Southern Africa presented more complex challenges, where white minorities had developed their own political institutions and economic interests that they were determined to protect. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s revealed the potential for extreme violence when colonial authorities attempted to suppress independence movements through military force. The British response to the rebellion, which included the detention of over 1 million Kikuyu people in fortified villages and the use of torture and summary execution, represented some of the darkest moments in the empire's final years. These methods ultimately proved counterproductive, turning international opinion against British rule and demonstrating that the costs of maintaining colonial control had become unacceptable to British public opinion. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked the definitive end of Britain's role as a global superpower capable of independent military action. The attempt to regain control of the Suez Canal through military intervention, undertaken in cooperation with France and Israel, was abandoned within days when the United States made it clear that American support would not be forthcoming. The humiliation of withdrawal under international pressure demonstrated that Britain could no longer act independently of American foreign policy and that the empire's strategic value had been superseded by Cold War considerations. Yet the transformation of empire into Commonwealth also created opportunities for new forms of international cooperation that transcended traditional colonial relationships. The Commonwealth that emerged from decolonization was a voluntary association of independent nations united by shared history, common legal and administrative traditions, and continued economic relationships. Countries that had been colonies became equal members of an international organization that could provide forums for dialogue, technical assistance for development, and cultural exchanges that enriched all participants. The Commonwealth Games, first held in 1930 as the British Empire Games, became a symbol of this transformation, bringing together athletes from around the world to compete in friendly rivalry rather than colonial subjugation. The sight of competitors from newly independent nations defeating representatives of the former metropolitan power in sports that had been introduced during the colonial period captured the complex legacy of empire in ways that political rhetoric could not. The economic relationships that had bound the empire together also evolved in complex ways. The sterling area, which had linked the currencies of most empire territories to the pound sterling, gradually dissolved as new nations developed their own monetary policies. But trade relationships often continued, shaped now by mutual benefit rather than colonial obligation, and British investment continued to play important roles in the economic development of many former colonies. The cultural legacy of empire proved perhaps the most enduring aspect of the imperial experience. English became the global lingua franca, facilitating communication across continents and cultures in ways that no language had ever done before. Legal systems based on English common law provided frameworks for governance in dozens of countries, while educational institutions modeled on British universities became centers of learning throughout the former empire. Cricket and rugby, football and tennis, spread far beyond their British origins to become truly global sports that continue to connect communities around the world. Literature written in English but drawing on non-European traditions and experiences created new forms of artistic expression that enriched world culture. Writers like V.S. Naipaul from Trinidad, Chinua Achebe from Nigeria, and R.K. Narayan from India used the language of their former colonizers to tell stories that revealed the complexity and humanity of colonial and post-colonial experience. Their work demonstrated that the empire's cultural legacy could be transformed into something creative and liberating rather than simply oppressive. The end of the British Empire did not mean the end of British influence in world affairs, but it did require fundamental adjustments to Britain's role and self-understanding. The special relationship with the United States provided one form of continued international influence, while membership in the European Economic Community offered another. But neither could fully compensate for the loss of the global reach and resources that empire had provided for more than 3 centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the end of empire forced Britain to confront difficult questions about national identity and historical responsibility that had long been avoided. The imperial experience had shaped British institutions, British culture, and British understanding of their place in the world in ways that could not be simply abandoned when formal colonial relationships ended. The multicultural society that Britain became in the latter half of the 20th century, enriched by immigration from former colonies, represented both a continuation of imperial connections and a transformation of what it meant to be British. And so our journey across the centuries draws to its close, like a ship returning to harbor after a long voyage. We have traveled together through time and space, witnessing the rise and transformation of an empire that once stretched across a quarter of the world. We have seen small fishing vessels become great fleets, trading posts become vast territories, and subjects become citizens of independent nations. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, as you settle back into your own place in time. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you, the temperature of the air on your skin, the rhythm of your own heartbeat marking time in this present moment. The empire we have explored together belongs to history now, its flags furled, its maps redrawn, its story part of the vast tapestry of human experience that connects us all. Perhaps what remains most remarkable about this imperial story is not the power that was exercised or the wealth that was accumulated, but the countless individual lives that were touched and transformed by. If you're still awake, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which empire should we explore next? Sweet dreams.